Some family dinners are just ordinary gatherings, simple conversations, laughter over old stories, light arguments that turn into jokes a few minutes later. But sometimes, a single night is enough to completely change the way you see your own family. And that is exactly what happened that Sunday night. For over 10 years, Mrs. Helen maintained a tradition that everyone in the family respected almost like a silent rule. Every last Sunday of the month, her children gathered at her house for dinner. It was nothing fancy. The same large table in the dining room, the same white tablecloth, the same food platters prepared with care. But after Helen's husband died 5 years earlier, these meetings took on an even greater meaning. It was the way she found to keep the family together. That night, everything seemed exactly as it always did. The smell of roast meat came from the kitchen. The children ran down the hallway. Mark, the middle son, told a funny story about a co-worker. Chloe, the youngest daughter, argued with her husband about which series they were watching. Conversations blended together. Silverware clattered on plates. Laughter appeared here and there. It was the kind of scene anyone would call normal, but there was a detail no one noticed at that moment. Luke, the eldest son, was different. He had arrived a few minutes late. Something rare. Luke was always the first to arrive. When he entered the house, he greeted everyone quickly, kissed his mother, and sat at the table. But he said almost nothing. While everyone talked, he seemed distant, thoughtful, as if he were carrying something he hadn't yet decided to say. At times, he would pick up his phone, look at the screen, then put it away again. Helen noticed, but she decided not to ask anything. She thought maybe it was just tiredness. But there was something in that silence that didn't seem normal, something heavy, something that Luke was clearly holding back. And no one at that table imagined that. A few minutes later, he would make a revelation capable of turning that family dinner into a nightmare. Because Luke hadn't come there just for dinner. He had come to tell a truth that had been hidden for decades, and that would completely change the history of that family. Dinner continued as it always did. Helen served the dishes carefully, asking if anyone wanted more rice or more salad. Mark told another work story, exaggerating the details as he always did. Chloe tried to get the kids to stop running down the hall. Everything seemed normal. But there was something starting to bother Helen. Luke was still quiet. Too quiet. He hardly participated in the conversations. He only answered when someone spoke directly to him. At times, it even seemed like he wasn't even listening to what the others were saying. Helen observed her son for a few seconds. Luke slowly moved his food around, pushing the rice from one side of the plate to the other. He had barely touched the meat. That wasn't typical of him. Luke had always been the calmest of the children, but he was never someone distant. "Luke," Helen said suddenly. The table grew a bit quieter. He looked up. "Hi, Mom. You're very quiet today. Is everything okay?" Luke was silent for a second, then he replied, "Yes, it is." But the answer was too fast, too automatic. Mark laughed. "That looks like a problem at work." Luke gave a small smile but didn't reply. Chloe noticed. "Seriously, Luke, did something happen?" He took a deep breath. He seemed to be thinking, as if he were measuring how far he should go. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Only the sound of silverware moving slowly across the plates. Then Luke placed his fork on the table. The small metallic sound caught everyone's attention. He rubbed his face. He took another deep breath and said something that made everyone stop immediately. "I need to tell you something." The sentence completely changed the mood in the room. Mark frowned. "What is it?" Chloe looked at him with curiosity. Helen remained still. She knew that tone. Luke didn't speak like that for just any reason. Something serious was coming. Luke looked at each person sitting there, as if he were gathering courage, and then he said slowly, "I discovered something about Dad." The silence that followed was immediate, heavy, because their father had been dead for 5 years, and no one expected to hear something like that at that dinner. But that was still just the beginning. because Luke was about to reveal something no one at that table was prepared to hear. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Helen was the first to react. "About your father?" she asked, confused. Luke nodded slowly. Mark rested his arms on the table. "What kind of thing?" Chloe seemed curious, but also uncomfortable. "Luke, you're making me nervous." He took a deep breath. "A few weeks ago, I started organizing some old boxes in Dad's apartment." Helen frowned. "What boxes?" "Things that were kept away after he died." Mark shrugged. "And what's strange about that?" Luke picked up his phone. He opened a photo. "I found some documents." He slid the phone across the table, but he didn't let go of the device yet. "At first I thought it was a mistake," Chloe asked. "A mistake of what?" Luke answered calmly. "A mistake in an old record." Helen seemed increasingly confused. "Luke, just say what you want to say." He looked directly at his mother, and then spoke something that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Dad had another son." The reaction was immediate. Chloe let out a small, nervous laugh. "That makes no sense." Mark shook his head. "Luke, you must have misunderstood." But Luke didn't argue. He just placed the phone on the table. On the screen was the image of an old document, a birth certificate, a name, a date, and right below it, their father's name. Mark picked up the phone first. He looked at the screen, and his expression completely changed. "Wait, is this real?" Luke replied calmly. "I checked more than once." Chloe took the phone. She looked, and fell silent. Now everyone was looking at Helen. She seemed motionless. "Your father would never do that," she said, almost whispering. But Luke wasn't finished, because there was something much stranger in this story, something that made everything even more disturbing. Luke rested his hands on the table and said, "That's not even the worst part." Mark looked up. "What do you mean?" Luke replied. "The worst part is that this person knows we exist." The silence became even heavier, because that raised an inevitable question. If he knew about the family's existence, why did he never show up? But the answer to that question would send that dinner completely out of control. For a few seconds, no one touched the phone on the table. The device was there, in the center, as if it were a dangerous object. Mark was the first to pick it up. He brought the phone close to his face and analyzed the image carefully. It really was an old birth certificate, yellowed, scanned, but perfectly legible. Child's name, date, city, and right below, their father's name. Mark ran his hand through his hair. This can't be true." Chloe leaned in to see better. When she read the whole document, her expression changed. The slight curiosity disappeared. Now there was something different on her face. Confusion. "Luke, are you sure this isn't some clerical error?" Luke shook his head slowly. "I thought exactly that at first." Helen still hadn't looked at the screen. She remained seated, looking at the table, as if she were trying to organize her thoughts. Luke continued, "So I started looking for more things." Mark looked up. "More things?" Luke nodded. "Old letters, receipts, some bank transfers." Now Helen finally looked up. "Transfers?" Luke answered calmly. "For years." Silence returned to the table. Chloe asked in a low voice, "So, Dad knew?" Luke replied without hesitation, "Yes." Mark seemed increasingly uncomfortable. "And this person, this son, knows we exist?" Luke took a deep breath before answering. "He knows." Chloe frowned. "How do you know that?" Luke rested his hands on the table. He looked at everyone there, and answered something that made the dinner atmosphere even heavier. "Because he contacted me." The silence that followed was even greater. Helen finally took the phone with slightly trembling hands. She looked at the document, and for a few seconds no one could read the expression on her face. But there was something Luke hadn't told yet. Something that would turn that discovery into something much worse. Because that person wasn't just a secret from the past. He was much closer than everyone imagined. And Luke knew it. After Luke said that, silence took over the room. No one seemed to know exactly what to ask first. Mark was the first to break the silence. "What do you mean he contacted you?" Luke remained calm. "Last week." Chloe's eyes widened. "Last week?" Mark seemed irritated. "And you kept this to yourself?" Luke replied without changing his tone. "I needed to understand first." Helen was still holding the phone. She looked at the document as if she were trying to find some detail that proved it was all a mistake. But there was none. "What exactly did he say?" Chloe asked. Luke leaned back in his chair. "He sent me a message." Mark frowned. "A message?" "Yes," Chloe asked quickly. "And how did he find you?" Luke replied. "He said he had been trying to locate the family for some time." Now Helen looked up. "He knew who you were?" Luke nodded. "Yes." Mark became even more confused. "This makes no sense." Luke continued. "He knew our names. He knew Dad had died. He knew we gathered here for dinner." The silence returned with force. Chloe put her hand to her mouth. "Wait." She looked around the table. "How would he know that?" Luke didn't answer immediately. He seemed to choose his words carefully. "Because he said he's already been close to us." Mark leaned forward. "Close how?" Luke replied, "Very close." Helen finally asked something no one had had the courage to ask until that moment. "What does he want?" Luke replied bluntly. "He wants to meet the family." Mark let out a small laugh of incredulity. "After all these years?" Luke nodded. "Yes." Chloe asked, "And did you answer?" Luke paused briefly before answering. "I did." Everyone looked at him at once. Mark asked, "What did you say?" Luke rested his arms on the table. "I said I needed to think." Helen seemed increasingly restless. "Luke, why did you decide to tell this today?" Luke took a deep breath. He looked at each person sitting at that table, and then said something that made everyone's heart race. "Because there's one more thing you need to know." Chloe spoke almost in a whisper. "What?" Luke answered slowly. "He doesn't just want to meet the family." Mark frowned. "Then what does he want?" Luke looked at the dining room door and said something no one there was prepared to hear. He wanted to be here today. The silence that followed was immediate, heavy, because everyone realized something disturbing at that moment. If that man really wanted to be there, then maybe he was already much closer than anyone imagined. Luke's sentence hung in the air for a few seconds. No one reacted immediately. It seemed everyone was trying to understand if they had heard correctly. Mark was the first to speak. "Wait, what do you mean by wanted to be here?" Luke kept his eyes fixed on the table. "He asked if he could come to dinner." Chloe's eyes widened. "You're saying he wanted to come here today?" Luke nodded. Helen pressed her fingers against the table. "And what did you say?" Luke replied calmly. "I said no." Mark let out his breath slowly. "Good." But Luke continued. "At least, that's what I thought had happened." Now everyone looked at him again. Chloe frowned. "What do you mean?" Luke took a deep breath. After I replied to the message, he didn't say anything else. Mark crossed his arms. "Then it's over." But Luke shook his head. "Not exactly." Helen asked. "Luke, be clear. What is happening?" He looked up. "This afternoon he sent me another message." Chloe leaned forward. "And what did it say?" Luke hesitated for an instant, as if repeating those words would make everything more real. "He wrote just one sentence." Mark asked. "What sentence?" Luke replied slowly. Maybe you've already seen me. The silence was immediate. Chloe looked around the table, instinctively, as if she expected to find someone different there. Mark tried to laugh. That makes no sense. But his voice didn't sound so sure. Helen asked, "Luke, do you know who he is?" Luke replied, "No." Mark frowned. "Then how could he have been close to us?" Luke rested his hands on the table. "That was exactly what worried me." Chloe asked in a low voice, "Worried why?" Luke replied, "Because he said something else in the message." Mark seemed increasingly impatient. "Luke, just say it." Luke looked at everyone there again, then toward the living room door, and said something that sent a chill down everyone's spine. He said that maybe he's already been in this house. Now no one spoke, because at that moment, everyone realized something disturbing. If that were true, then someone none of them knew could have already been there, at the same table, at the same dinner, watching that family, without anyone noticing. And Luke hadn't yet told the most unsettling part of the message, something that would make everyone at that table start looking at each other differently. The silence at the table was no longer just uncomfortable. It was heavy, almost suffocating. Everyone seemed to look at Luke, expecting him to explain that story better. Mark was the first to speak again. "Luke, are you saying this guy might have already been here at the house?" Luke replied calmly. "That's what he hinted." Chloe crossed her arms, clearly nervous. "But that's impossible. We would have noticed." Luke didn't reply immediately. Instead, he picked up the phone again. The message didn't end there. Mark frowned. "There's more?" Luke nodded. "Yes." Helen seemed increasingly tense. "Luke, read the message." He unlocked the phone. He looked at the screen for a few seconds and began to read aloud. "I know this situation must seem strange to you." The table became completely silent. Luke continued, "I don't want to cause problems in your family." Chloe took a deep breath. Mark kept his eyes fixed on him. Luke went on, "But for many years I wondered what you were like." He paused, briefly. "Your father never talked much about you, but I knew you existed." Helen closed her eyes for an instant. Luke kept reading. "A few times I was close." Chloe immediately asked, "Close how?" Luke returned his eyes to the screen. He wrote exactly like this. "Maybe you don't know, but I've already been closer to your family than you imagine." Mark let out his breath slowly. "This is getting weird." But Luke wasn't finished yet. He continued reading the last part of the message, and his voice slowed down a bit. "Maybe one day you'll realize you've already crossed paths with me." Chloe frowned. "Crossed paths with him where?" Luke finished reading. "Because sometimes the truth is much closer than it seems." The silence returned to the table. Now everyone seemed restless. Mark asked, "Luke, did you show any photo of yourself to him?" "No." "Then how could he know who you are?" Luke replied, "That was exactly what I asked." Chloe leaned onto the table. "And what did he answer?" Luke looked at the phone again. He didn't answer. Mark frowned. "Then it's over?" Luke shook his head slowly. "No." Chloe asked, "Why?" Luke looked up and said something that made everyone exchange looks immediately. "Because he viewed my last message and exactly at 7 in the evening." Helen frowned. "And what does that mean?" Luke replied calmly, "It means he was awake at that time." Mark shrugged. "So what?" Luke looked around the table, at each person there, and said something that made everyone's heart race. 7 in the evening was exactly the time we started this dinner. Now no one seemed comfortable anymore, because everyone realized something disturbing. If that man was online at that exact moment, maybe he was much closer than anyone imagined. After Luke said that, No one spoke for a few seconds. The silence that took over the table was different than before. Now there was something new mixed in. Suspicion. Mark was the first to look around the room, instinctively, as if he expected to find someone watching through the door or the window. "This is getting ridiculous," he said, trying to sound calm. But his voice didn't sound so sure. Chloe also looked around. "Luke, do you think he is near here?" Luke took a while to answer. "I don't know." Helen finally spoke again. "Maybe it's just a strange way of speaking." Luke agreed with a small nod. "I thought that too." Mark crossed his arms. "Then why are you making all this suspense?" Luke rested his hands on the table. "Because there's a detail I haven't told yet." Chloe sighed. "Luke, what now?" He picked up the phone again. After the 7 o'clock message, he sent another. Mark frowned. "Another one?" Luke nodded. "Yes." Helen seemed increasingly nervous. "What did it say?" Luke looked at the screen for a few seconds, then he replied, "It was just a question." Chloe asked quickly, "What question?" Luke looked up. He asked if dinner had already started. The silence returned immediately. Mark stood still for a moment. "Wait, what do you mean?" Luke repeated. He asked, "Has dinner started yet?" Chloe put her hand to her mouth. "Luke, this makes no sense." Mark seemed irritated. "Of course it doesn't. How would he know we are having dinner?" Luke replied calmly, "That was exactly what I thought." Helen asked in a low voice, "Did you reply?" Luke nodded. "Yes." Chloe asked, "What did you say?" Luke replied, "I said yes." Mark shook his head. "And then?" Luke looked at the screen again. "Then he sent another message." Chloe seemed increasingly restless. "Luke, what did he say?" Luke took a deep breath before answering. He said it was good to know the tradition continued. Mark frowned. "What tradition?" Luke answered slowly. "Sunday dinner." Now the silence was even heavier, because there was something extremely strange in that sentence. That man didn't just know the family existed, he knew about the dinner, something that practically no one on the outside knew. Chloe looked at Luke with a confused expression. How could he know that? Luke replied in a low voice. "That was exactly the question I asked myself." Mark asked, "And did you reach any conclusion?" Luke looked around the table again. Then he said something that made everyone freeze. "Maybe he knows. Because he's already been here." Now no one could ignore that possibility, because if that were true, then the man could have been in that house at some point, much closer than anyone imagined. And Luke still hadn't told the last message he received, the message that would completely change that night. The tension at the table was already impossible to ignore. No one was eating anymore. The plates were practically untouched. Mark rested his arms on the table, staring at Luke. Chloe seemed restless, fidgeting with her fingers without realizing it. Helen remained silent, but her expression showed she was trying to understand it all. Luke held the phone in his hands. "There's one more thing," he said finally. Mark let out an impatient sigh. "Luke, it seems there's always one more thing." Luke ignored the comment. After the message about the dinner, he sent another. Chloe asked immediately, "What did he say?" Luke took a few seconds before answering, as if he were reliving that moment. He wrote just one sentence. Helen looked at him. "What sentence?" Luke looked up from the phone. He said, "Maybe you've already seen me more than once." Mark frowned. "That doesn't mean anything." But Chloe seemed more restless. "Luke, did you ask who he is?" Luke nodded. "I did." Mark leaned forward. "And did he answer?" Luke replied slowly. "Yes." The silence returned to the table. Chloe asked, "What did he say?" Luke took a deep breath. He said it wasn't the time to tell yet. Mark rolled his eyes. This is starting to look like a joke. But Luke continued. After that, I asked something else. Helen asked in a low voice. What? Luke replied. I asked why he never showed up before. Mark said, Good question. Luke looked at the phone again. His answer was strange. Chloe asked, Strange how? Luke replied, He said he needed to wait for the right moment. Mark frowned. Wait for what? Luke replied, For the family to be ready to hear the truth. The silence that followed was heavy. Chloe seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Luke, this is starting to scare me. Mark tried to keep a rational tone. It's probably someone trying to create confusion. Luke shook his head. I thought of that too. Chloe asked, Then why do you think it isn't? Luke picked up the phone again. Because he sent one more message. Helen asked, When? Luke replied, A few minutes before I arrived here today. Now everyone was attentive. Mark asked, What did it say? Luke replied slowly. He wrote, Maybe today you will finally understand. Chloe frowned. Understand what? Luke looked up. That was exactly what I asked. Mark seemed impatient. And did he answer? Luke paused, briefly. Then he said something that made everyone immediately look toward the dining room door. Yes, Mark asked. What did he say? Luke replied in a low voice. He said the answer was sitting at the table. The silence that followed was absolute, because at that moment, everyone realized something disturbing. If that were true, then one of the people there might not be who everyone thought. And no one at that table was prepared for the revelation that would come next. Luke took a deep breath once more. Helen, Mark, Chloe. He began, his voice firm but loaded with tension. The answer is here, right in front of us. Everyone looked at each other, confused. What do you mean? Asked Helen, her hand trembling on the table. It's simple, said Luke, holding up the phone and showing the screen to everyone. A new message appeared. Look around, I am with you. Chloe swallowed hard, her eyes scanning every corner of the room, every shadow. Mark stood up, restless. Luke, this is some kind of joke. Did someone enter the house? Luke shook his head. No, there is no one here. At least, not physically. The silence became deafening. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall broke the tension. So, what does this mean? Asked Chloe, her voice almost a whisper. Luke looked at each of them, taking a deep breath before saying, He has always been with us, but in a way no one could see. He is someone Dad hid from everyone, and who for years watched the family without being noticed. Someone who now reveals himself not as an enemy but as part of our story. Helen pressed her arms against her body, trying to control her fear. Part of our story, but how? Luke swallowed hard. This man is our half-brother. He always existed, but for some reason my father decided to keep him away. He grew up knowing about us, studying us from afar, and today, finally, he wants to be recognized. Chloe felt a chill. So, he is here? Now? She stammered. Luke nodded slowly. He is with us in this room, in a way, and his last message is a warning. He wants us to know that he never completely abandoned us, even though his presence was invisible. Mark leaned back in his chair, breathing heavily. This is too much to process. How can someone... He waited for us, Luke completed, his voice firm, for the right moment, for the moment when we were all together as a family to finally hear the truth. Helen looked at her children, her eyes welling up. So, should we receive him? Luke took a deep breath. I believe so. Not as someone who haunts us, but as part of our family that has finally revealed itself. The silence continued, heavy and tense, but now there was also a strange sense of hope. An invisible but tangible presence seemed to fill the room. The Sunday dinner, which began like any other, ended by revealing something that would forever change the concept of family for everyone there. And at that moment, each of them knew that the night would never be forgotten. Some family secrets don't appear in old photos. They don't come with hidden letters or hurried confessions. Sometimes they emerge in silence, in the gaze of someone who suddenly realizes that nothing was as it seemed. The story of that dinner isn't about right or wrong. It's about something that happens in many families, secrets that stay hidden for years, until someone decides it's time to reveal them. And when that happens, there is a difficult question everyone at the table had to face. Were we prepared for the truth, or just ignoring signs that had existed for a long time? Luke didn't tell the story to scare anyone. He told it because he knew the time had come. A moment when the whole family would need to face something that was much closer than they imagined. And perhaps this story leaves an important reflection. Sometimes, the hardest part isn't discovering a secret. The hardest part is accepting that the truth can change everything you thought you knew. If this story touched you, and leave your comment below. I want to know your opinion. Could you handle a revelation like this within your own family? Like the video so more people can feel the same tension of this story. Share it with someone who likes mysteries or family stories. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that reveal the deeper side of human relations. Because here we tell stories that seem ordinary, but that hide secrets capable of changing everything in an instant. See you in the next video.